Systematic conservation planning, especially when we start to consider the effects of climate change, is not a one-time activity. It requires constant monitoring and an adaptive approach that allows for new information to enter into the planning process at any time. In this video, we will discuss the process and the importance of adaptive management. Adaptive management is a structured, iterative process of robust decision-making in the face of uncertainty with the goal of eventually reducing that uncertainty over time through monitoring efforts. The systematic conservation framework that we looked at earlier is an example of an adaptive management approach. The decision-making process about what to protect and where to direct conservation resources occurs simultaneously as new information about the system is being gathered. This new information is then used to improve future management and improve long-term outcomes. This means that adaptive management is a tool that is not only used to manage or change a system, but also to learn more about it. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, conservation management was focused on keeping a landscape as is, keeping it in a pristine state. The result was that natural ecosystem processes, especially fire systems, were suppressed in order to save the landscape and protect its wildlife. However, this management approach rarely, if ever, resulted in its intended consequences, and in many cases has actually moved parks and protected areas into a state where they are primed for catastrophic fire. For example, take a look at these two photos, which were taken at the same place at Old Fort Point in Jasper National Park. The one at the top was taken in 1915, just 8 years after the park was established, and shows a heterogeneous landscape characterized by a thin forest and a low tree line on the slope in the background. The photo on the bottom was taken in 2019. Over a century without a fire in the area has led to the forest becoming much denser, and it has also reached a much higher elevation. The second photo also shows a second consequence of management decisions focused on keeping the landscape as is. The red color that you see in the pine trees is the result of a devastating mountain pine beetle outbreak. Although outbreaks of mountain pine beetle are natural and have been a part of this forest system for thousands of years, climate change, and specifically warmer winters, has made their outbreaks more frequent and more severe. This is particularly true in areas where fire suppression was common, as the denser forests that have resulted from the practice have allowed the beetle to proliferate and spread much quicker than it would in forests where the natural fire regime was able to take place. Today, conservation planning recognizes that we work in a world that is constantly in flux, and that we cannot maintain landscapes as we see them today in perpetuity. Therefore, conservation planners take the dynamic nature of ecosystems into account, which requires more monitoring of ecosystems, but also allows us to be more responsive to changes that occur within them through both natural and anthropogenic means. For example, if we think about forested ecosystems, they inevitably change over time through the process of succession. A new forest evolves out of a major disturbance when plants begin to colonize barren ground. Eventually, tree species that do really well in situations with a lot of light, things like birch and larch, will start to colonize the area. Eventually, these trees grow large enough that they begin to shade the forest floor, meaning that more shade-tolerant species like spruce and hemlock are able to gain a foothold into the system. And some of the older individuals of the more shade-intolerant species will begin to die off, creating gaps in the forest that the shade-tolerant species will fill. Eventually, the trees will mature and the understory and forest floor will develop into a mature old-growth forest. Now, I know I just described a linear process, but in reality, disturbances like fire or a windstorm can create gaps in the forest at any point, pushing at least part of the system back to an earlier stage. So the forest is a highly dynamic system. The point is that ecosystems and landscapes are in constant flux and are constantly changing, and it is important to account for this in conservation planning. Adaptive management is a tool that allows us to do this. A major component of taking a more adaptive approach to conservation planning and recognizing the dynamic nature of ecosystems is to develop and put in place a robust monitoring system. Parks Canada does this through its State of the Park assessments. These reports provide a snapshot of the state of the park, reports on achievements on meeting management goals, and the changes since the previous report. Each park is expected to produce a State of the Park report every 10 years, and the cycle for these is staggered from the park management cycle, which is also done every 10 years, to allow for the new information produced by the State of the Park report to be incorporated into the next management plan. The results of these reports are based on monitoring data collected by park scientists and field technicians for a suite of indicators which taken together communicate the overall condition of the park. For each indicator, the current state is determined as being either good, fair, poor, and if it is not the first report, the current state is compared to the previous reports to determine the trend of the indicator as either improving, stable, or declining. Parks Canada also uses a similar framework to evaluate the state of each park, which allows them to get a sense of the state of the whole national park system. For example, ecological integrity is based off of a combination of native biodiversity, aquatic ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, landscape and geology, and climate and atmosphere indicators. However, the exact measures that are incorporated into each of these indicators varies from park to park. For example, in Jasper and the other mountain parks, the state of native biodiversity is evaluated as a combination of the caribou, grizzly bear, and elk populations, bird diversity, carnivore monitoring, and wildlife mortality. But in the Acadian forest of Kejimkujik National Park, these measures don't make a lot of sense. So the native biodiversity is evaluated through a combination of tree, salamander, bird, and lichen populations, as well as invasive plant presence and forest successional patterns. Taking a more adaptive approach to conservation planning is a time-consuming and resource-intensive process, but the payoff is a conservation system that is more effective over the long term because it is able to react relatively quickly to changes on the landscape. An adaptive management approach to conservation also allows us to be more explicit, transparent, and scientifically rigorous in our treatment of risk and uncertainty in the planning process, something that will undoubtedly become even more important as climate change progresses. By shifting away from a focus on static ecosystems and trying to maintain the landscapes as we see today or saw 100 years ago, we are changing our perspective on what biodiversity conservation means, and we are accepting that ecological systems are dynamic and ever-changing entities.